Welcome to Poker Market, making poker more efficient.
What is up, guys? This is Weasel for PokerMarket.com. Today we're going to be talking about semi-bluffing. So, what can we expect in this episode? We're going to start off with a definition of semi-bluffing, really basic stuff. What is a semi-bluff? We're going to then start looking at the expectation of various semi-bluffs and consider which variables impact on our expected value. We're going to talk about the true break-even point of a semi-bluff. Now, you're probably familiar with break-even points, but we're talking about something slightly different here, which is the effective break-even point of a semi-bluff. If this is not something you've ever thought about, or you don't know what we're talking about, don't worry, we're going to explain it when we get there. We're also going to have a look at the impact of implied odds on semi-bluff expectation. Now, this is something that you will rarely hear anyone ever talk about. Usually when players are calculating the expectation of a semi-bluff, they purely look at the street they're on in an attempt to determine their expectation. But in order to fully relate to the profitability of a semi-bluff, we need to be aware of variables on later streets which can impact on our expectation. One of the reasons why players maybe don't consider what can happen on later streets is that when we first start thinking about implied odds, we generally take a very basic situation. For example, we might look at a turn scenario where we shove all in with a flush draw. We know that there's going to be zero river play in that situation because we are already all in. Either our opponent folds or he calls, and then we know exactly what our expectation is after our opponent calls because everyone is all in, we're guaranteed to see a showdown. But what about situations where we're not all in and there is potentially going to be some play on the river? This is going to impact on the expectation of the semi-bluff itself and may influence whether we decide to actually semi-bluff based on the break-even point of our semi-bluff, the true or effective break-even point. So don't worry if this sounds confusing. Let's start at the basics, which is the definition of semi-bluff. So far, we've looked at value betting, we've looked at bluffing. Hopefully these made sense. I would imagine 95% of watchers already know exactly what a value bet and a bluff and a semi-bluff is, but let's define our term. In some ways, you could think of a semi-bluff as a cross between a value bet and a bluff, but essentially a semi-bluff is a type of bluff. It's one where we have a significant pot equity factor. For example, we're bluffing on the turn, but we have a flush draw as well. What that means is our bluff doesn't actually need to work at the break-even point, the one we defined in the previous video, where we had a look at the percentage of the total pot we are investing. So to give an example, let's say we bet 2/3 pot. Hopefully we already know that a 2/3 pot bluff needs to succeed above about 40% of the time to be directly profitable. But assuming we have something like a flush draw, which means even when our bluff fails, we can sometimes go on to win the pot based on our pot equity. It means our bluff no longer needs to work 40% of the time. In fact, our bluff can work considerably less of the time given that we have some pot equity. Now, this is not what we mean by effective break-even point, although it is a type of effective break-even point. The break-even point of our bluff is effectively lowered because we have pot equity. Now, many of the bluffs we make on earlier streets are technically semi-bluffs. For example, even if we fire a continuation bet on the flop with garbage, which is not generally something we should do, but let's imagine we do that, we might think of it as a zero equity bluff, but we often have a pot equity component. Perhaps we have something like an overcard against some of the holdings in our opponent's range. And while that might not give us a huge amount of equity, it does give us some equity. We'll often still refer to these scenarios as bluffs, but the truth is that a bet on any street before the river is usually actually a semi-bluff. There's some crossover here in the way that we use linguistics. Any bluff and flop and turn is ultimately a semi-bluff unless we know for certain that we're drawing dead, then we can call it a bluff.